So we're really happy to see everyone here tonight. Our speaker today is Sarah Alwin. Sarah is a part-time PhD student in the School of English at the University of Sheffield. She's writing about literary and filmic depictions of domestic spaces in Singapore and Malaysia, and her work concerns the resonances of external social, historical, and political forces within the internal spaces of the home and their effects on those that populate these spaces. Sarah will be speaking for about 25 minutes, and after this, we will hear comments from Professor Kenneth Paul Tan. Professor Tan will, of course, be familiar to many. He is a professor of politics, film, and cultural studies at Hong Kong Baptist University. He's written extensively on a very wide range of issues to do with culture and politics, including specifically about film and other texts, the focus of Sarah's presentation today. We're very grateful to Kenneth that he's agreed to lend his expertise and support as the discussant for today. After Sarah and Kenneth have spoken, we'll have another 20 minutes or so for a Q&A with audience members. So I will ask you to note that the session is recorded, and to minimize distractions, please keep your microphones and cameras off when speakers are speaking. And when it's time for Q&A, I will invite you to either put your questions in the chat box or to turn on your cameras then. All right. Well, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Hello, thank you everyone. I hope you can hear me all right. So first of all, I just need to say a few thank yous. I'm quite nervous about presenting in front of such a distinguished audience. And I would like to thank Ryan for organising, Sylvia too. I'd like to thank you, Yen, for agreeing to chair, to Kenneth for agreeing to be discussant. For me, this is a really lovely opportunity to share some of my thoughts and speculations about the film Shirkers. I really admire and respect the work of Academia SG, which to me is an incredible interdisciplinary community with integrity, vision, and warmth, most importantly. I would like to thank my supervisors, Dr. Veronica Barnsley and Professor Richard Stedman-Jones for their support. I also have to thank Sandi Tan for her correspondence with me over the last 2 years. She has been generous and honest. I have to thank Ben Harrison too, who wrote and performed the missing soundtrack of Shirkers, for his support and correspondence. Finally, I have to thank my mother, Connie Shears, for keeping me in touch with Singaporean matters through newspaper clippings from the book and culture section of the Straits Times, and also endless otter stories that the Straits Times seems to be so very fond of. So this is how she keeps me connected with all things Singaporean. A real gift for me in presenting here in Academia SG is the chance to hear what you, the audience, might have to say about my seminar. I know that your comments and thoughts will help in the development of this chapter and allow me to refine my tone and scope. I have at times felt very disconnected from Singapore, but like all the texts that I'm very much interested in, I always try to write with warmth and affection about the country and its spaces. I recently listened to A Desert Island Disc with Nick Cave, and he wrote very poignantly about the fact that all writing is an act of love, and it really touched me. I feel this to be the case in all the texts that I've studied and in my thesis as well. I want to be clear that I know that writing about Singapore and Singaporean spaces can be difficult. There are silences, omissions, and absences everywhere. And I know that I cannot fill them. I'm also wary of the terminology nostalgia in my title. Now, I realize I was so nervous that I've forgotten to share my slides with you, but I will do that now. And you can see that in my title, I use the phrase alternative nostalgias. And I know that this can be a problematic term because it can be weaponized for purposes that are not warm or kind. and for destructive movements like MAGA and other worrying reworkings of known orthodoxies. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on this. And to be clear, I don't think that this is the function of nostalgia in the text Shirkers. I also want to talk about the broader context of my work. My main interest is in domestic space and its meaning, and to contextualize, my thesis is concerned with depictions of domestic spaces in Singapore and what was known as Malaya in the work of Somerset Maugham, Anthony Burgess, Han Su-yin, Teo So-lung, Jeremy Tiang, and Sharlene Teo. This chapter that I'm talking about now is a departure from mainly written prose, fiction work and some non-fiction to different kinds of media. And my current chapter that I'm going to present to you actually looks at the work not only of Sandi Tan, but also of Kirsten Han, Sonny Liu, and Kok Ho and the Cassia resettlement team. And I know that Yu Yen, the chair of this seminar, was an extremely important contributor to that work. They told us to move as well. I'm aware that these are very disparate texts, but they do form part of an ecosystem in my mind. And I feel that they're very connected and they speak to many spatial imaginings of Singapore. So just to get us started, there are two quotes that I've put on this slide that I feel sort of speak to the heart of what I'm getting at in this seminar. Sandi Tan wrote to me recently, we've already lost so much. I didn't want us to lose our memories too. This way, the film can be a refuge people can return to over and over. And also a quote from William Gibson in his 1993 piece, the physical past here has almost entirely vanished. And I think these were the two quotes that I wanted to address a little bit in this presentation. The presentation explores a depiction of Singapore in Sandi Tan's film Shirkers and its role in shaping an international image of the city. Through absence and silence, Shirkers crafts a nostalgic yet impossible vision of 1990s Singapore. More than a rediscovered indie film, it serves as a critical Singaporean text, illuminating issues of creativity, censorship, and national representation. I'm trying to examine how Shirkers contributes to a cultural and spatial imagining of Singapore and trying to situate it within broader discussions on film nostalgia and geopolitical perceptions of the city-state. Sandi Tan's 2018 documentary, Shirkers, recounts the loss of a film that Tan shot with two friends, Sophie Siddique and Jasmine Ng, in 1992. They did so under the tutelage of their mentor, George Cardona, but after filming wrapped up, they never saw the film again, and Cardona absconded with all the materials from the shoot. On the surface, this documentary is about the rediscovery through Cardona's widow in 2018 of all the reels of film from 2 decades earlier. It could be seen simply and superficially as a nostalgic, sumptuous, vibrant, color-saturated vortex of teenage camaraderie and adult betrayal. However, Shirkers is more than a coming-of-age tale, and it is an important Singaporean text. Indeed, Rajiv Patkar and Philip Holden contend that the short and the indie film have perhaps taken on the role of the novel as serving as a national historical representation of the imagined community of the nation. Its place amongst literature based in Singapore is sealed due to the wide reach that its Netflix accessibility and many plaudits have granted it. As a text which showcases Singaporean space, it also has a role to play in the perception of the island in the wider context of geopolitical relations. Shirkers is significant for its place in a cultural and spatial imagining of Singapore because it points to certain absences. In Disneyland with the Death Penalty, the notorious or even seminal article about Singapore for Wired in 1993, American author William Gibson writes sweepingly and perhaps unfairly that the physical past here has almost entirely vanished. I would like to avoid, if I can, the often foreign bias about the nature of social discourse in Singapore that has relied on known criticism of the state by external watchers, or parroting flawed assertions about Singaporean politics. And I consider that Gibson's, while well written, might now legitimately have the slur clickbait attributed to it. The contemporaneity of his nevertheless Orientalist perspective with the filming of the original Shirkers allows us to give this observation some consideration. And it is noteworthy that some of the motive for making the film was tied inextricably to wanting to preserve in celluloid the places that were disappearing in Singapore, the spaces for which the writing was already on the wall. When Tan, Siddiq, and Ung are given their film back, all the sound recordings are missing, either lost or deliberately destroyed. Tan says, wryly or stoically, Shirkers was returned to us a mute. And it is this lack of sound when restored that removes a layer of reality and increases its mythological quality. In tandem, Kirsten Hahn considers the matter of silence when she remarks that Singapore is a country of citizens living in comfort and relative luxury, yet cautious and afraid of a shadow they can't quite name, suggesting a voluntary self-censoring or muting of everyday life. Kenneth Paul Tan, our discussant today, also writes sharply of a culture of self-regulation which has little need for enforcement. He writes that the sustained use of coercive instruments has been mostly unnecessary, since widespread knowledge of their existence alone, and perhaps the occasional demonstration of their power, has been sufficient to generate a climate of apprehension in which Singaporeans will regulate their own behaviour and practice modes of self-censorship, making restrained calculations about what they can or should say and do in a panoptical society. This seminar focuses on absence and the idea of muting or censoring a version of Singaporean space, a kind of subverted Singaporean imaginary, which in itself generates an otherworldly or unreal aesthetic. Sandi Tan states at the start that the film was a time capsule of a Singapore that was both real and imaginary, deliberately merging ideas of fictionality and documentary. There is a very playful quality to this ambiguity too, where fiction allows a nostalgic and aesthetically sympathetic framing of the places that are part of that documentary, non-fictional and vanishing or vanished past. And I feel that this is in no way a gloomy or polemic film. However, there are some very tangible consequences of filmmaking in the creative burgeoning of Singapore in 1992. Where an ostensible opening up of the creative industries to aid economic growth had particular side effects which had not been mitigated against. It is worth considering the context in which a charlatan such as George Cardona was allowed to operate. Indie filmmaking in Singapore was and is seen as a way to gain economic and cultural traction in much the same way as courting the Formula One Grand Prix is. The substation where Cardona worked was established in 1990, and it was Singapore's first independent arts centre and a place for artists and intellectuals to work and develop. It has become a national institution since, but it is in those first years of its existence that Cardona and these young filmmakers shot Shirkers. Cardona's treatment of the film and the filmmakers reveals a lack of due diligence, or at least a very extreme naivety in establishing an independent art scene or cultivating young creative talent. David Lim and Hiroyuki Yamamoto observe of Kenneth Paul Tan's work on the swift and perhaps less than organic growth of creative industries in Singapore that he delineates film and filmmaking as part of the Singapore government's strategy to develop the creative industries, not for their own sake, but rather to instrumentally develop Singapore's capitalist economy. If, as part of developing a cultural hub, presumably to enhance the comfortable life of which Kirsten Hahn speaks, the state decides then to promote the creative industries. It is also critical that this should be done with the ethical consideration of the quality and integrity of the provision for this development. Elmo Gonzago writes of nostalgia and its place in the nation's view of itself, that The small island city-state of Singapore has had a unique relation to its past because of its need to make itself attractive and amenable to foreign capital for the sake of economic growth. This outlines a self-consciously crafted view of the past, which is echoed in texts such as Shirkers. Gonzago develops the argument that the use of nostalgia to cultivate a sense of the nation belonging, a sense of nation belonging amongst Singaporeans amid feelings of alienation from conditions of constant change. So disruption due to economic progress is the primary catalyst of the text in this chapter. And Shirkers is emblematic of the wish to preserve and record spaces which at the time of filming felt very endangered. Sandi Tan herself perhaps inadvertently raises the question of the film as a true or authentic portrayal of a relentlessly documented adolescence, or even indeed of the city, and whether the boundaries between reality and artifice can really be demarcated. The intensely staged scenes and surreal sequences are edited afresh in this. Sorry, I'll just move the slide along somewhat. So the intensely staged scenes and surreal sequences are edited afresh in this 2018 reimagining to disorienting effect. This is not any version of Singapore that you're likely to find again, and its preservation in film appears as an act of ideological defiance, redefining those lost spaces. The film is a documentary and presented as a non-fictional account of the making and losing of a fictional feature film. It therefore straddles the real and unreal, even in the bones of the spaces that it portrays. It is possible to read the deliberate scouting of locations as contrived and artificial and merely performative. As Tan recalls herself quite openly, I made sure they found the mannequin shops and the old-timey bakery that I loved because I knew they wouldn't be around for long. It is certainly the case that many of the 1992 locations no longer exist, and their current absence is another symptom of the changing face of the city-state turned cool, as Kirsten Hahn might put it, for the comfort of its citizens. Film critics such as Michael Atkinson write longingly that the first Shirkers looks like what would have been a perfectly lovely, impetuous, endearingly jerry-built film of the era, rich with chintzy composition and larky moments, and its absence from the culture of the time is a shame. This might be true, but Shirkers, in being re-edited after its period in the wilderness, is almost more valuable to the viewer now, having had its absence felt in the years between. The potentiality of the original Shirkers weighs heavily, but the scope of the lapse of time, and ironically the removal of all dialogue and sound, appears only to ameliorate the sentimental and nostalgic effect of the film. In addition, part of the lovely, impetuous and jerry-built aspect of the film is all artifice, and it's actually carefully staged saturation of space, particularly domestic space. In the scene depicted in the slide, we have a carefully staged kitchen, and it shows the character of TB and TJ's mother smoking at the kitchen table while TJ plays with the radio. It is cluttered and could be described as a noisy place, both literally and figuratively, despite the lack of soundtrack. It's messy with the kitchen accoutrements to an exaggeration of domesticity. There is a pig's trotter on the table with the kitchen knife inserted jauntily, and this is a homely space which is self-consciously overwrought and filled with Kodachrome filter and primary colours that date it, and also give it, in 2018 on Netflix, those larky overtones that Anderson describes, as well as its compelling nostalgic ambience. This scene wears its artifice openly, as much of the footage from 1992 does. To contextualize, in the 1990s in Singapore, this overcrowded and color-saturated look was not exactly fashionable. And when Tan speaks of other films that come after, notably Wes Anderson's Moonlight Kingdom in 2012, or Terry Zweigoff's Ghost World in 2001, she is referencing an aesthetic of saturation which only comes into its own later. This staging of domesticity is defiantly ironic. with little attempt at realism, and its absurdity is highlighted by the loose smoking of TB's mother while at the kitchen table in a Singapore where smoking was at the time starting to be heavily legislated against. In these domestic spaces, the noise is inferred rather than heard, as the audio is absent, and in some ways, it is the objects and their placing which makes the noise in the film, bombarding the viewer with the clutter and materiality of lived-in spaces. In the film, Sophie Sadiq comments that Shirkers has this very palpable absence. Sorry, I've skipped backwards. And this is such a remarkable comment. She uses the word palpable for absence, explicitly acknowledging all the time, as all the filmmakers in this film do, that the very real presence of the film in 2018 sits starkly against its absence in the intervening years. It's almost not being is as important as its being. Every time I look at this remark, it makes me think again about the difference between something being palpable and something being absent. And I can watch that scene over and over again. But to continue, Ginny Kim Watson, writing about the work of Tan Pin Pin, suggests that spatial imaginaries underpin triumphant narratives of Singapore's rise. And here, I suggest that the spatial imaginaries of Shirkers, due to the film's unfinished and stolen nature, do something very different. They do not represent a triumphant view of Singapore. Rather, the spatial imaginaries in this film dislocate and distort the boundaries between the documented and undocumented pieces of a puzzle with layers of symbolism or reinvention. We observe a text which was self-consciously constructed on a budget, on a con, that was stolen, that was lost, then returned with an important layer, all its sound completely missing. The documentary employs many techniques that point to the artifice of the text, employing collages and postcards and other artifacts such as maps and letters associated with the shoot, as well as more contemporary shots of Singapore. And this has a further alienating effect, a kind of Brechtian Verfremdungs effect, deliberately distancing us in some ways from the subject. I find it impossible not to think of John Cage's silent piece, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, and when watching Shirkers transform into the mute that Tan describes. In considering the film's absence of sound, or the absence of the voices of its actors at the time of its making, it is worth thinking about it as a space which can contain the void that its missing soundtrack has left in its wake. An absence that is palpable, as Sadiq points out, which is an astonishing contradiction that can be used to highlight other paradoxes in this work. As actors speak their lines in 1992, the viewers can only lip read while the 2018 soundtrack plays wistfully over their voices. This undoubtedly changes the text from its original intent and exposition, and these layers of reinvention create this disorienting effect. So in Shirkers, the use of the wide shot situates this sense of absence visually. In the example on this slide, Tan is walking down an empty expressway. She cuts an isolated figure in keeping with her character, the assassin S. Here, time and place are key to contextualizing this particular shot. In 1992, it would have been possible to find an expressway which could accommodate filming in this way. Today, with the congestion of cars in a Singapore whose population has more than doubled since the filming took place, it is almost impossible to find any road, let alone a major arterial route, so empty. It is an explicit instance of a measurable absence or emptiness in the past, and also a significant change over time. On an island where space is at a premium, issues of comfort and equilibrium have to be carefully regulated. Shirkers never deals directly with these concerns, but instead its absences speak to them implicitly. Over this scene near the start of the documentary, Tan voices her feelings of wanting to get away, of wanting to escape, and of longing to be a shirker. The desire to escape and to become a shirker, one who avoids duty or responsibility, may be a perfectly natural reaction to the careful calibration of the Singaporean landscape, its constant changes and growth cycles, and the expectations put upon its citizens to conform and adapt to these national orthodoxies. Nostalgia for times when the expressways were emptier or the shop houses more jumbled is perhaps understandable when the onward march of progress might make these experiences and sights seem out of reach. A sense of alienation or isolation and an instinct for retreat is probably natural when everything, including a burgeoning art scene or the emergence of creative industries, appears to be up for grabs, a transaction to be negotiated. There are several examples of editing in Shirkers where the themes of absence or voiding of space are more carefully or explicitly signposted even than in the expressway scene, which has to be inferred from a distance of a decade or a couple of decades. Later, for example, when the nurse Cecilia takes Singapore's largest dog, Cherish, for a walk, the viewer is invited to see the space without its leading characters in the very next frame. This sense of space as needing context through participating actors is at once moving and obvious. Tan remarks over this sequence, it's more than a physical time capsule. It's not just scenery and disappearing buildings, but it's also people in those places. It is a reference which is poignant for alluding to the suppression of truly creative industries in Singapore, and the original Shirkers and its consequent loss are a symbol of the denigration of creativity in preference to the performance of a film industry for international cultural capital and real financial gain. A lack of care or ethical due diligence is the reality in this situation, and what is also unsaid is that these young female filmmakers had no recourse to claim their film back, no institution to which they could turn when they needed it, even though they were articulate, resourceful, and otherwise extremely well supported. People in those places are no longer there, and it is not merely the passage of time which has eradicated their presence, or rather facilitated their absence, but the reality that those people are not supported by the structures of the state, that instead require creative output to have also economic benefits. Gonzago comments further, drawing on Marianne Hirsch's work on post-memory, how highly resonant personal, communal, and cultural images and stories of the shared experience of previous generations have found enduring materiality in the popular imagination. And Shirkers does the work of perpetuating a poignant and resonant nostalgia for a carefully curated and shared past. Economic development and the pragmatic moves of the state mean that the past is luxuriously underpopulated in comparison with the present, the past being saturated with colour and character, where the present can seem to lack these compelling qualities. Seeking images of a comforting past is a reaction to strains in the population's everyday lives. And Gonzago expands on this argument. This is a bit that I find a little bit problematic, and I wonder if you do too. He writes that faced with the further expansion of the resident population, many Singaporeans were aggrieved at the suddenly congested transit system and competitive job market, as well as the potential erosion of local customs where their lives had been relatively comfortable. Shirkers overtly and unabashedly celebrates this at times overwhelmingly and strangely multisensory view of the past through its places and ornaments, but remains silent, explicitly at least, about the political and economic conditions which sustained that past and consequent, perhaps less quirky or characterful present. Nostalgia for the past becomes a symptom of discontent and perhaps a way of assuaging feelings of discomfort or of voicing dissent. And part of the appeal of texts like Shirkers is in its colouring of that imagined past. If Shirkers is a surreal or idealized and very self-consciously constructed place which has no plot line, no real plot line, and is a mood piece, as Sophia Sadiq calls it, which has lost its voice through a pernicious imposter who has stolen some young filmmaker's work, should it not also say something about that shadowy space in the half-hidden recesses of a national consciousness? This is a precursor to thinking about the ways in which spaces and absences in this film also present a marginalizing or alienating and distancing effect so that the viewer becomes ever more unsettled. The sense of nostalgia that a viewer might feel can be explained through the void created by the loss of sound. And Johanni Palasma writes of architectural absence. Ruins and eroded settings have an especially evocative and emotional power. They force us to reminisce and imagine. Incompleteness and fragmentation possess a special evocative power. This observation applies very much to Shirkers, and there is a sense not only of the evocative power, but also of the visceral understanding of the loss that incompleteness brings. It is not simply that the film has been muted, but it has also been stagnated in time through its captivity. So this is it's just part of the chapter that I'm writing at the moment. And I'm also writing about other texts in this chapter, including The Art of Charlie Chan Hok Chai, which you can see pictured in this slide. And because I don't usually work in visual images, I usually work with the written word. I'm always very struck by similarities that I see, and I've made a comparison here between his depiction of the changes going on in Geylang Hill in The Art of Charlie Chan Hok Chai, and the view that we see in that shot in Shirkers. And I'm interested to know if the audience feels that there are some similarities or not, and whether I was going to put all sorts of images in here, including some images from Instagram of people who post stuff about how they've changed their HDB flats around the area that the Cassia resettlement team was working on, and they told us to move. And here is a shot on the left from I think this is from the Our Better World website, or Between Two Homes website, which is about the work of the Cassia resettlement team from Dakota to Cassia, and a shot from Shirkers. And I don't know whether I'm making some false equivalents here, and that's what I'm quite wary of. So I just wanted to show you those. So forgive me for going on for so long, but I did want to give you some context for why I'm writing about Shirkers. But thank you so much for listening to my seminar. And I'm really interested to hear what you all think.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was great. Can I invite Kenneth now to give his comments? Kenneth?
Sure. Thank you, Yoyan. And thanks very much, Sarah, for an excellent presentation that I really enjoyed. I thought it was full of honesty and insight. I saw Shirkers a couple of years after it was screened in Singapore. I saw it on Netflix, and I remember being at the time struck by two or three different things. And I thought I might share some of these impressions and maybe say a thing or two about how they might have evolved, especially after listening to you present your piece. I mean, one of the things that struck me most about Shirkers was that it was really complex in being a multimodal a documentary, and in that way, it really forced me to ask at the time, who gets to tell the story, what parts of the past are reclaimed, reshaped, what parts are misunderstood or simply unknowable. And by weaving together all these multiple genres and perspectives, I thought Shirkers became more than just a film about a lost film. It was really a kind of reflection, a meditation on authorship, on loss, on the impossibility of fully recovering the past. And I thought it was, the way that Shirkers was a self-reflexive kind of excavation of history and memory. It really made us rethink not just what was lost, but also what we and how we choose to remember. And as a political scientist in the first instance, I thought that was tremendously exciting. And the second thing that struck me, and maybe a more vulgar kind of idea that struck me about the film was its resonance with post-colonial and I guess decolonial critique, particularly, of course, in the figure of Cardona, right? Cardona, who is a literal reflection of colonial history. Here's a white man who arrives to mentor, to inspire, naively willing local talents, but ultimately he controls and exploits them, and perhaps even for sadistic reasons. And I found it a very lively idea because in post-colonial Singapore, this logic of control and dependency hasn't disappeared, right? And you note that as well in the ways that we think about the creative city, for example. So we see that it has shifted. It has kind of shifted from imperial rule through the Cold War and into a phase of, I guess we could call it neoliberal global capitalism. So in positioning itself as first a global city from the late 1980s and then a creative city, right, from the 2000s, Singapore has become increasingly subservient to international capital and foreign talent, sort of prioritizing economic performance over genuine creative autonomy. The creative industries, rather than being a space for independent artistic expression, are largely shaped by state policies designed to enhance Singapore's global economic standing. And you point to this as well in your presentation. And this is precisely what the decolonial agenda, I think, seeks to dismantle today, not just acknowledging past colonial subjugation, but actively breaking the structures of colonial logic that continue to shape whose voices get heard, whose stories get told, and who controls the means of production. Today, and also after listening to your presentation, I find myself thinking about Shirkers as a film that has lived three rather than two distinct lives, each of them occupying a different space and shaping its significance in different ways. So the Lost film of 1992, that of course is its first life, right? Originally conceived as an independent, experimental feature with, again, as you point out, locations deliberately scouted, right? In order to preserve these overlooked spaces from urban development and redevelopment. But many of these places, they actually haven't physically disappeared. And I know this because I live in a neighborhood where many of these structures actually still exist. Yet, I think they have disappeared in another sense, right? Not a physical one, but they have been absorbed into gentrification, into a tourism agenda, right? Into, I guess, a nostalgia chic, right? Which is rebranded and revalued for a rather different purpose. And so when I think of the second life, right, which is the documentary of 2018, what I'm seeing here are images that are repurposed through personal reaction, reflection, and a historical critique. But also, I see that the documentary romanticizes and aestheticizes a lost Singapore, which in some sense turns it into something pleasurably consumable, almost an Instagrammable nostalgia product, right? So I asked myself whether Shirkers, the documentary of 2018, also performs a kind of gentrification of this lost Singapore. And then there is the third life of the film. Let's call it the digital afterlife on Netflix, right? So the film exists in Netflix as a kind of, or rather, it exists in the space that is algorithmically driven. Right? Its meaning is shaped not just by Sandi Tan's framing, but by Netflix's platform logic, right? By its global reach. And so if Shirkers was once stolen by, what's his name again? Cardona, right? Stolen by Cardona. Is it now appropriated yet again, recategorized as a quirky, lost documentary, right? Stripped of its Singaporean specificities and the politics surrounding them? Now, in all of these three lives, the missing documentary, sorry, the missing film, the documentary, and then its existence as part of an algorithmic curation, right? In all of these three lives, I do see Cardona as not just an individual, but as a recurring ghostly figure in cultural appropriation. First, I see him as a colonial thief in the first life, right? An original source of trauma. He is a charismatic adult who encourages and steals from and tries to limit youthful creativity. Then in the second life, Cardona returns as gentrification and the cultural branding of the global city, creative city, tourism city, whatever you want to call it. But in this city, Shirkers, the movie, the documentary, its success um, within the city as well as beyond the city, right, also feeds on a form of gentrification as well. And then in the third iteration, the third life, Cardona returns again, right? But this time as an algorithmic curation of streaming platforms like Netflix, which promises global reach and strategic success. So Cardona, the colonizer who eternally promises success, is always welcomed in self-loathing post-colonial Singapore, morphing into new structures of appropriation and silencing, muting, right? And so all of this brings me, I guess, to my question for you, Sarah. Would you say that Shirkers, in its production of alternative nostalgias, through the depiction of Singaporean spaces, would you say that it ultimately reinforces this cycle of appropriation and silencing, or does it actually offer novel ways to break out of this endless, eternal cycle? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for those insights, because I think it's really interesting that you point out that there are perhaps three lives rather than two lives to this film. Ultimately, I think that what Shirkers does it tells a story that I had not heard before, and I'm not, I don't know whether that's because I wasn't listening out for the stories. But to me, it sort of shows something Singaporean that has just got an amazing wide reach because of Netflix. That is a story that I'd not encountered before, and also I feel that it does so with such warmth that I understand everything that you're saying about the gentrification of those images, because it's certainly true. I felt when I was watching it, wow, okay, I was in Singapore in the 1990s. I don't remember this. And I remember that seeing shop houses and stuff like that, I found it like a bit distasteful. I just thought, oh, all this clutter and mess. And that's where I'm coming from. That's the context from which I'm coming from. And what I liked about it was that it dealt with those spaces of clutter and disorder with love. And the warmth that I felt from this film, I thought was really important. One thing that Sandi Tan wrote to me very recently was she said that the fan mail that she gets is not primarily from Singaporeans. It's from places like Brazil, for example, where people have watched a film and they relate to the space. So she talked specifically about spaces and their depiction. And I found that really fascinating. Now, I think if a film tells a story about a country that a lot of people aren't that familiar with, that's a lovely thing. But I agree with you that there are some issues that perhaps, but they didn't find a space in this film. And I think we get them from elsewhere. But I don't know if that answers your question, Kenneth.
Well,
Thank you.
it does. At least it gives me a clear sense of that you've seen in this movie and the reactions to it, particularly an international reaction to it, warmth and appreciation. I wonder though, and you sort of point to this in your presentation at the beginning, at the end, and at the end, where you situate it in a kind of this critical discourse, right, amongst the creative as well as the scholarly and maybe the activist communities. So there's a lot of critical potentiality in the film, which maybe will always remain local, right? Because it's pointing to very specific histories and remembering and reimagining and so on and so forth. I mean, the fact of its international appreciation and warmth and so on, does it, does it detract from the potential of a film like this to participate in a wider, broader movement to get us to be much more critical about the forms of history that we have inherited and which shape our potential for imagining futures, right? So in that sense, does it delocalize it too much, by its international exposure to such an extent that it loses the opportunity to be as critical as it should?
I wonder if I could interject here, just because we only have about 15 minutes. I think this is a great
Sorry.
discussion, and no, thank you very much, Kenneth, for your comments, and it's great that Sarah's responded a little bit. Maybe we can circle back to this and just take a pause to see if there are also other questions that audience members would like to ask. Would anyone? You can either raise your hand or you can drop your questions in the chat. I can't see. Okay, if there are no questions right at this moment, I guess I can turn this back to Sarah if Sarah would like to continue with the response you were going to make.
Thank you, Yuyan. I think you're right, Kenneth, that the critical element of Shirkers is implicit. I think that it's the function of silence is multifaceted in this film, and that it serves several different purposes. And I think I'm very interested in the idea of positionality of the audience. And that's where being on Netflix, as you say, gives it a whole different life, because there's a bunch of people watching it who haven't got the first clue of what Singapore is, and where it is as a place. And I'm very conscious of when I'm watching a film like Shirkers, I'm thinking all the time, oh, here I am sitting in Sheffield, what connection have I got? And then I realize that a large proportion of the audience of this film will not have set foot on Singaporean soil and will not have felt whatever resonances that some of us here feel. And I think it's really interesting because I think the film touches upon many things. For example, she mentions the courtesy campaign in Singapore. And I remember this as a child, the courtesy campaign. And, it is, I think it's easy to underestimate those cultural moments, actually, for people that experience them, that these were moments in Singaporean life that were really unusual, and that you don't really realize how unusual they are until you've got a little bit of distance from it. So there are things like I found the smoking thing very interesting, because I remember as a teenager the way that smoking suddenly became a really unacceptable criminalized activity, actually, in certain spaces, because I remember when people smoked in restaurants, and then now I realize there's only a very tiny places in Singapore where you can smoke now. And I thought about the fact that at the time, Sandi Tan made sure all her female characters smoked. I mean, to me, that's quite a defiant statement. So I think that the film, yeah, maybe it doesn't say, all right, I'm not so sure about these government policies, but it does make those points in kind of that quirky way. And it's rebranded again as, quirky again. And you know, I think that's what makes it palatable actually for a wider audience. But yeah, it's so interesting because it depends where your audiences come from, whether they think this is weird or not, in many ways. And I think that another thing about, you know, when Tan talks about other people aren't there anymore, I think she's saying that, you know, what has Singapore done to the creative industries? What is this? Is this a performance? And that's what I get from it anyway. And I don't know if that's true or not. And certainly I tried in the chapter, and I haven't talked about these texts, but the work that the Cassia development team did in They Told Us to Move, I think that really addresses some of the stuff that's going on, ideas around gentrification, if I can even say that word any longer, domestic space, social housing, the most vulnerable and marginalized people in Singapore. I think that piece of work is absolutely like so important because it explicitly lays out what the government did and how they went about it, and you know what those people's lives are like. And I think sometimes we get a little bit removed from that, and so I try to bring those together. And if we talk about nostalgia and looking back at the past, I want to be really careful about how I position that. And I hope I've outlined some of my own concerns about the concept of nostalgia, how problematic it can be, because we can look back at social housing, for example, and say, oh, you know, wasn't it great what was going on in the Dakota estate? Well, patently something needed to be done, but how it was done is a question that can be addressed and looked at. And those are really critical things. And I think about the art of Charlie Chan Hock Chai. I think about the Singapore story and, you know, as a child, what you're told about Singapore and its origins and things like that. That to me, it's really important that even if we have an alternative nostalgia that we think is a little bit off, that we think there's a little bit like, oh, it's a bit Instagrammable, or oh, it's a bit shiny, or you know, we've got a guy who writes for Marvel and he's doing this. I still think it's incredibly important work because getting it out there and getting it that face time is really important as well, in my opinion. And I know it's not perfect work, you know. I think Philip Holden also writes about the dangers of this nostalgic, let's look back at history and see alternative readings of history, and I know that there are inherent dangers in doing that, and I'm trying to be quite cautious and careful about those things. I don't know if that answers the question.
I wonder if I could add to this, or sort of add a different sort of angle to this question, because earlier in your talk you mentioned that, you know, you're looking at these texts as part of an ecosystem, right? And that implies that in some ways they have different roles or functions, for lack of better words, so different like a different place in the sort of overall stories that are told about Singapore. And I wonder, I mean, Kenneth's question seems to indicate that sometimes if the stories are told for an international audience, that leaves less room in some profound way for a Singaporean audience that has a more complex relationship to those places, maybe have a more complex relationship to loss and gain, right? Have a more complex relationship to memory and nostalgia. So if you're thinking about those different texts as an ecosystem, where exactly do you see Shirkers placing? I mean, is it what role, I guess, do you see it playing that those other texts don't play, and what do those other texts do that Shirkers can't seem to access or doesn't seem to access?
Oh, that's a really great question, Yuyan. I think that Shirkers, because of its position on Netflix, kind of it has the accessibility thing going for it in a way that other texts don't. So if you want to get the art of Charlie Chan Hock Chai outside of Singapore, I guess it's a little bit trickier to get hold of. Is it? Maybe not. But, it requires you to pick up a text and read it, which, like if you're just scrolling through Netflix, you might chance across Shirkers. So I suppose that accessibility is one thing. And I'd love something like They Told Us to Move to be much more, what do you call it, prominent in bookshops. But certainly, if I'm trying to purchase that in Sheffield, I have to go through Ethos Books, I think it is, and purchase it from Singapore. So that is not a text that's available. And also, it's not everybody's bedtime reading. So the place that Shirkers has, in my mind, and in part of this chapter, is it's the shiny outward-facing text, which has been showcased at film festivals. It came to Sheffield at a film festival here, documentary festival here. And I think maybe Shirkers is less consumed in Singapore because perhaps because the audience isn't looking for it or doesn't need it. I don't know. I don't know whether that's true or not. And I don't know if it's a story that all Singaporeans want told, but certainly I found it very interesting. When looking at those spaces made me think about how I saw those spaces at the time. And I didn't see them like that. And I thought that was a really wonderful thing. So for me, it was like a little bit of rewriting of history that I thought was interesting and fun, and whereas I feel that something like The Art of Charlie Chan Hock Chai is it's fun as well. It's beautiful work. It's got that shininess as well. But you have to seek it out more, and you have to be really interested in the Singapore story and to sort of absorb it and take it in. The other texts that I use, Kirsten Han's work, The Silhouette of Oppression, and the work that you contributed to, Yo-Yen, they are less accessible to an international audience in terms of they're harder to get hold of, and people have got to have a real interest in Singaporean matters to pick them up and read them. But I wish everyone would read this stuff, because I think it holds lessons about social housing for every country on the planet. Seriously. The work on that Kirsten Han is doing, I mean, because she's so involved in activism, it relates a lot to Beyond the Blue Gate, which is a text that I look at earlier on in my thesis. I feel that those spaces are so fascinating and interesting, and they really deserve a spotlight on them. And how that happens is the thing to, how do you make a text meaningful and serious, but also attractive? That's the balance that you're trying to strike all the time, I think.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. As you're talking, I mean, I'm struck by another thing, which is that the text, we're now looking at all the different texts you've categorized as somehow playing a kind of role in resisting, right? But maybe what we also need to hear about, or what you might want to write about more in terms of setting up in your chapter on in your dissertation, is what is it resistance against? What are the dominant stories, right? I mean, to a Singapore audience, I think there's a sort of general sense of what you're talking about. Why are these things subversive, or why are these things somehow on the edge, and why are they pushing boundaries? But without knowing what is in the middle and what is taking up most of the space, I think that's the story is a little bit incomplete.
You're right. Yes, absolutely. And yeah, we can talk about, like we can say that unsaid thing, which is that, the state control is it's something that can really hinder like the creative industries, for example. And when it's done in a heavy-handed way, it can be very difficult to work with. And those are the things, we mute ourselves. I mean, I find that when I'm writing myself, I find myself not writing about certain things because they're difficult. They're very hard to pin down. And I think that's what, I mean, I know that Cherry and George has done a lot of work on this, a lot of writing about, the air conditioning and the calibration and all of that. And we're complicit with it. Most people are as well. So that's a really good point, Yuyen. Thank you.
Okay. So with that, actually, our time is up. But I wonder if Kenneth would like to say anything else, or maybe last couple of seconds. Anything you want to jump in with after this, after Sarah's responses?
No, it's just thanks for responding so carefully and considerately. I think it's a terrific piece of research you're doing, and I can see it contributing to kind of more nuanced theorization on things on